so happy you're here. So I've known Steve for a long time. I'm not entirely sure when I first became aware of Steve Almond. It's actually hard to imagine a time in my life when I didn't know Steve was out there in the world making things savagely entertaining, as one-starred Kirkus Review put it. The timeline appears to be thus. I moved to Boston in the early 2000s, and suddenly he seemed to be everywhere I went. I would show up to a reading and Steve would be DJing, for example. I'd get involved with a literary organization and he would be on the board, or I'd turn on the radio and his voice would be coming out of the speaker. Once I went to a party and it turned out to be his party. He was like this cool older brother I never thought I wanted, which is to say he seemed to be setting an example for how to be in the world. So I'm pretty sure Steve Almond is omnipresent. Either that or he works like osmosis through his many books, his wickedly insightful commentary, deeply humane advice. Are there any Dear Sugar fans here? Yeah, cool. Through his generosity in the classroom and beyond, Steve Almond makes the barriers of the world more permeable. Now, I realize I just glazed over Steve's entire career in one sentence. So to say a few more words about his many literary accomplishments, I'd like to bring up Anna Vodica, who will be giving a proper introduction as well as conducting the onstage interview after Steve's lecture. And a little bit about Anna. Her essays and travel writing have appeared in a variety of magazines and anthologies, including Afar, Brevity, Guernica, Harvard Review, the Iowa Review, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, Long Reads, Paste, and Lonely Planets and Innocent Abroad. Her writing has been selected for Best Women's Travel Writing Pushcart Prize Special Mention, the Missouri Review Audio Prize, and Best American Essays and Best American Travel Writing Notables. In addition to earning residency fellowships to the Vermont Studio Center in Hedgebrook, she teaches here at Hugo House and in the Women's Creative Writing Program at the King County Jail. So please join me in welcoming Anna Vodica.
Thank you again so much for being here. I know there are a number of really amazing events going on tonight all over the city. Jericho Brown is here, Jenny Lewis, the town hall is open again. But you know, so we really appreciate you guys being here with us at the Hugo House. So, Steve Almond is the author of 13 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers Candy Freak and Against Football, Rock and Roll Will Save Your Life, Not That You Asked, My Life in Heavy Metal, and a personal favorite, the delightful short volume Letters from People Who Hate Me. His short stories have been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, Best American Erotica, and Best American Mystery Series. He has published over 150 essays and reviews in places like the New York Times Magazine, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. And if you find his voice oddly reassuring, you may be familiar with the beloved New York Times podcast, Dear Sugars, which he co-hosted with fellow writer Cheryl Strayed. He joins us from Arlington, Massachusetts, where he is a regular correspondent on NPR's Here and Now and WGBH Boston. A co-parent to 3 kids with his wife, the writer Erin Almond, and he also teaches at the Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard. Writing about his latest book, William Stoner and the Battle for the Inner Life, the writer Pam Houston said, "Gazing into William Stoner with candor, humility, tenderness, his customary wit, and an ocean of compassion, Steve Almond finds there himself, flawed, flayed, but weirdly whole in spite of everything. Stoner is a theorem that proves art saves lives." On a personal note, because I think Steve Almond is just the kind of person we all want to get personal with. Very quickly, it's so easy. I have been a Steve Almond fan since I was an undergraduate in Boston in 2004 when Candy Freak was published. And in the 15 years since, I have shared that book and so many other Steve Almond gems with friends, family, my own writing students, and I have turned his writing even more frequently in these absurd modern times as a source of sanity, compassion, vulnerability, and that giant middle finger he's always raising to late capitalism. Because while Steve's writing can be deeply personal, it is always expansive, steeped in literature, history, and journalistic instinct, and enormous care for the greater we. And we are all collectively better for it. I know he's got a lot of Seattle fans, so please join me in welcoming Steve Almond.
Okay, hi. I'll take my glasses off and you're all going to become really attractive. A little fuzzy, but very hot. So, we'll see how this goes. It's a piece called The Man at the Top of the Stairs. The Man at the Top of the Stairs. Can everybody hear okay? Does everybody have a seat who needs one? Good, okay. Over the past decade, my taste in literature, or at least my engagement with it, has shifted rather dramatically. I spend most of my reading time reading to my children. The books are usually really charming while also being somewhat insufferable. Curious George, for instance, is both the account of an irascible chimp unleashed in the big city and a chilling tale of interspecies abduction. Babar the Elephant has the same ripe flavor of unacknowledged colonial predation, with the added twist that Babar clearly serves as a sexual slave to his rapacious octogenarian mistress. That is what is happening in those books. I could go on here, but won't. I mention these books not because I know every fucking word of them by heart, but because as I thought about how to discuss the inner life without sounding like the pretentious asshole I surely am, my mind kept returning to one particular moment from a book called I'll Love You Forever. That book by Robert Munsch is about a mother who has a ritual of rocking her only child back and forth and singing him this song. I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. The baby grows up into a powerfully destructive toddler, which is to say, into a toddler. But at night, when the storm within him calms, his mother picks him up and rocks him and sings that same song, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. Then, as so often happens in children's books, things get weird. The child grows into a teenager, and yet the ritual continues. The mom waits till he's asleep and picks him up and rocks him and sings to him. This pattern continues into his adulthood. The mom gets into her car and drives to his house. And if the lights are out, she opens his bedroom window and crawls across the floor, and she picks up this grown-ass man and rocks him and sings to him. So, okay, super kinky, borderline criminal behavior, but also sweet. Eventually, though, the mom is too old and sick to continue breaking into her son's home and rocking him to sleep, so he drives to her house. The mother tries to sing to him, but she can only get out the first two lines. And so the son goes and picks up his mother and rocks her and sings to her. Then comes the moment that haunts me. Munsch writes, when the son came home that night, he stood for a long time at the top of the stairs. And that's it. That's the line. When the son came home that night, he stood for a long time at the top of the stairs. I could tell you, of course, what the man does next, that he then goes into the room where his own new baby daughter is sleeping, and that he picks her up and rocks her back and forth, and sings to her. But that's not the part that sticks with me, because that's not the part that reveals his inner life. All the sadness and bewilderment, the ecstatic paralysis that grips him at the top of those stairs as he seeks to reckon with the death of his mother. A lesser writer, a writer more like, for instance, me, would have felt the need to articulate that paralysis, to dive into the dark abyss of this guy's soul, to replay the highlight reel of his maternal experiences, to grant him a flourish of defensive rage or an aria of anguish. That is so often our instinct as writers and human beings, to render the inner life as performative rather than a shared experience. Because, after all, we have all stood at the top of those stairs have all stood in terror and sorrow and confusion before the enormity of the pain we risk, not as any function of misfortune or calculated assault, but simply by the miracle of our birth into this species. We've already been shown everything we need to know about that man and all he bears. Our job is simply to bear witness, to not look away, to feel what we already feel. This is a rather indirect way of saying something pretty simple, that it is the mission of all art, but literary art in particular, to engage with the inner life. And all I mean by the inner life is the private set of thoughts and feelings, of yearnings and fears and confusions that are concealed from the world and yet persistently, unavoidably experienced. At this point, I should confess to all of you that my mom and dad were both psychoanalysts. I will now pause rather pregnantly to allow you and your inner life some freak-out time. There will be a general assumption that I am mentally ill, at least a little bit, but I mention this by way of noting that I come by my preoccupation with the inner life honestly. Here's a quick story about what it was like to grow up in my house, since you are all wondering. One night at dinner, my older brother Dave started recounting this crazy dream. He was racing around his room because he was late for his job at Swenson's ice cream parlor. When he finally got to Swenson's, he found a fancy cocktail party in progress. He was handed a platter to carry around with little dishes on it, but rather than ice cream, the dishes had Russian dressing in them. At some point, Dave realized that he was in his underwear, and he was taken with a great humiliation. We were all like, "Weird dream, dude." Then my dad said, "Freud talks about this. How some dreams contain puns." "What pun?" Dave said. "Well, you were late for work, so you didn't have time to put your pants on. There was a rush in dressing." Russian dressing. What? That's what it was like to grow up in my house. Many years later, I found myself working as the world's most inept investigative reporter. My job was to document the escapades of notable scoundrels, dirty cops, con men, but I kept pondering motive. What had possessed these people to self-destruct? The interior life is a real life, as James Baldwin observes, and the intangible dreams of people have a tangible effect on the world. I decided to ship off to an MFA program where those intangible dreams could be exposed, examined, rendered into story. When I told my boss, he glared at me for a good half minute. "You want to write books?" he said finally. I didn't know what to tell him. I just had a hunch I'd been paying attention to the wrong part of the human arrangement. Everyone in my MFA program dreamed the same dream. If we worked hard enough, if we read the right books, if we charmed the prevailing mentors, our work would be plucked from the slush pile, gussied up for publication, and bound into handsome volumes by the bad parents of New York. At precisely this point, everyone who had ever rejected us would be forced to admit the terrible mistake they had made. A few months into the program, near the end of some drunken revel, a classmate asked me if I'd ever read the novel Stoner. As a veteran stoner, I assumed the book would be a tale of psychotropic hijinks. It is not. The book begins like so. It's just the opening paragraph. William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year of 1910 at the age of 19. 8 years later, during the height of World War I, he received his Doctor of Philosophy degree and accepted an instructorship at the same university where he taught until his death in 1956. He did not rise above the rank of assistant professor, and few students remembered him with any sharpness after they had taken his course. Stoner's colleagues, who held him in no particular esteem when he was alive, speak of him rarely now. To the older ones, his name is a reminder of the end that awaits them all, and to the younger ones, it is merely a sound which evokes no sense of the past and no identity with which they can associate themselves or their careers. Cliffhanger. To understand how audacious I found this opening, you would have to know how loyal I was back then to the dogma of the MFA program, the smothering exhortations to show, don't tell. Because I lacked confidence in the stories I was trying to tell, because those stories were at best half-formed, I reliably plunged into the consciousness of some poor schlub in the midst of an unspecified crisis. I assumed this chaos would beguile my readers, that they would hunger for all the facts I withheld from them. I was writing almost entirely out of my insecurity. It wasn't just the flat expository style of Stoner that flummoxed me. Williams had opened his novel by dryly announcing the insignificance of his protagonist. I assumed the point of literature was to document the lives of the lawless and lust-driven, in short, the memorable. It hadn't occurred to me that the story of every life is, from a cosmic perspective, one of obscurity. You are alive for some brief span, then you die. The Great Mirage is a kind of a feel-good lecture. It's going to get even cheerier. The great mirage of human consciousness is that our striving deeds will render us immortal. It might be said that I had confused literature with history, which serves as the de facto press office of the infamous. This confusion redounded to my own corrupt ambitions. I wanted from literature to be known by the world. I had missed the point. Literature exists to help people know themselves. None of this occurred to me on that first night. I remember only that I read Stoner in a spell and that I wept a good deal, inexplicably, though not unhappily. Stoner enthralled me because it offered something I'd never encountered so purely, a dogged devotion to the inner life. Because the book so stubbornly refuses to hurdle Stoner toward a traditional conception of heroism, it has regularly gone out of print, only to be resurrected by nutbags like me. The author's own agent, Marie Rodell, thought the book was a loser. I mention this not because I have a secret desire to humiliate literary agents. On the contrary, my desire to humiliate literary agents is quite public at this point. But because her assessment of the novel is so spectacularly wrong-headed, she fretted that Stoner would never sell because, quote, its technique of almost unrelieved narration is out of fashion. In fact, it is the novel's narrative style that makes it so gripping. The book begins with that blunt little obituary, which has the effect of shifting the reader's curiosity away from Stoner's achievements and toward an accounting of his internal experience. What's less apparent, but just as crucial, is that this opening establishes a narrator capable of covering huge swaths of time and experience in a few sentences. This latitude allows the author, John Williams, to present the precise moments that throw Stoner's inner life into disequilibrium. 2 pages into the novel, Stoner's father announces that his son will leave their subsistence farm and go to college to study agriculture. And then he gives a little speech, the dad, which we're told is the longest speech that Stoner has ever heard him give. He says, "Never held with schooling when I was a young'un, but now I don't know. Seems like the land gets drier and harder to work every year. It ain't rich like it was when I was a boy. County agent says they got new ideas, ways of doing things that they teach you at the university. Maybe he's right. Sometimes, when I'm out in the field, I get to thinking." Stoner's father is not someone who talks about his inner life. But that doesn't mean he doesn't dream and fear and wonder. He knows his son is doomed if he doesn't do something. Sometimes, when I'm out in the field, I get to thinking. Stoner arrives at college and his life shifts again. In his required English course, a professor reads him a sonnet by Shakespeare and asks him to comment. Stoner can summon no words, but the world around him suddenly takes on a phantasmagoric intensity. Quote, "Light slanted from the windows and settled upon the faces of his fellow students so that this illumination seemed to come from within them and go out against a dimness. A student blinked and a thin shadow fell upon a cheek whose down had caught the sunlight. Stoner marvels at the intricacy of his hands. He feels the blood flowing invisibly through his arteries. He wanders the campus, taking in the bare gnarled branches of the trees curled and twisted against the pale sky. He regards his fellow students curiously, as if he had not seen them before and felt very distant from them, very close to them. The compression of sensual and psychic detail makes this passage read like a reverie, though something quite simple is happening. Literature has awakened William Stoner's soul. It's important to note this distinction. The rendering of the inner life isn't achieved by announcing to the reader that a character is feeling a lot. Such assertions of emotion, by and large, register as sentimental, right? That's what sentiment is, the assertion of emotion. And genuine emotion, it has to be experienced by the characters. What happens is that characters actually start paying attention to the world around them, which inevitably reflects the world within them. In fact, every few pages, Stoner is slammed up against some harrowing realization, some impossible decision, some uncontrollable urge. This relentless pacing is a direct result of the narration that his agent disparaged as unrelieved and out of fashion. As writers living in an age dominated by visual storytelling, our tendency is to conceive of drama in the way TV shows and movies do, the ginning up of public confrontation. The enduring lesson of Stoner is that the real action resides not in public outcome, but private reverberation. Here, for instance, is what happens when Stoner finally confesses to his mother that he won't be returning to their farm. Quote, "His mother was facing him, but she did not see him. Her eyes were squeezed shut. She was breathing heavily, her face twisted as if in pain, and her closed fists were pressed against her cheeks. With wonder, Stoner realized that she was crying, deeply and silently, with the shame and awkwardness of one who seldom weeps. He watches her for a moment more, then returns to his room where he stares into the darkness above him." We don't have to be told what Stoner is feeling. We are left to witness him, in essence, at the top of the stairs. Stoner falls in love with a beautiful young woman who is also remarkably damaged. She doesn't want to marry Stoner, or she certainly doesn't want to have to sleep with them. So here are a few delightful moments from their honeymoon. Quote, "He pulled her a little toward the bedroom, feeling a quick, hard resistance in her body, and feeling at the same moment a willed putting away of the resistance. When he touched the softness of her thighs, she turned her head sharply away and lifted her arm to cover her eyes. She made no sound." The scene culminates with Edith retching loudly and agonizingly in the bathroom. I am sharing this particular unpleasant portion of the book in part because it demonstrates how much our inner lives express themselves through our bodily actions, but also because I believe that nearly every woman in this room and outside of it has experienced something similar, a moment in which their bodies are announcing, "I do not want to have sex," while their brains, conditioned by patriarchal threat, are telling them to just get through it. Stoner's marriage proves torturous and his academic career is undone by a rival professor. He reaches a point where he begins to question whether he wishes to continue living. On one snowy night, he turns out the lights in his office and listens to the silence, quote, "the sounds that were absorbed by the delicate and intricately cellular being of the snow. Nothing moved upon the whiteness. It was a dead scene." He slips out of his own body and everything, the flat whiteness, the trees, the tall columns, the night, the far stars appear tiny and far away as if dwindling into nothingness. This is the individual apprehended in a moment of pain so intense it triggers a cosmic disassociation. You don't have to be an English professor to hear the echoes here of Joyce at the end of The Dead. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling. Or Frank O'Connor at the end of Guests of the Nation, quote, "The old woman and the birds and the bloody stars were all far away, and I was somehow very small and very lonely." I often point my students to these passages as a demonstration of what I mean when I tell them to slow down where it hurts. I stress this because our tendency in life and in writing is to do just the opposite, to hurry past our most abject moments as if by doing so we might erase them from the record of our inner lives. Williams doesn't run from the darkness within Stoner, he runs into that darkness. Storytelling is not some mystical pursuit. It is mostly about building psychologically and emotionally reliable ramps to moments that matter and then slowing down. The reason is mechanical. If you cannot move the action forward, the writer's attention must turn in some other direction, inward, backward, or outward toward a world that maps the inner life. Stoner is eventually resurrected by a brief and intense affair with a younger colleague, but the most enduring object of his love is his daughter Grace, a quiet, thoughtful child whom he cares for and adores. The most piercing tragedy of the book, therefore, is the manner in which Edith Stoner essentially abducts Grace. She appears suddenly in Stoner's study one evening and orders Grace to leave. Stoner assures his wife that the child is not bothering him. Edith ignores him and repeats her directive. Bewildered, Grace rises from her chair and walks toward the door. She pauses in the center of the room, quote, looking first at her father and then at her mother. Once again, we don't have to be told what's happening inside her. We know that she's trying to figure out who's in charge and at the same time imploring her father to rescue her. He doesn't. Instead, Edith redesigns the girl's life in a manner inimical to her nature. Stoner tries to dodge the horror of what's happening, but Williams won't let him. One day, he encounters Grace in the living room, and they exchange shy smiles. Involuntarily, Stoner kneels and embraces his daughter. Her body stiffens. We can see instantly what's happened. She's become a hostage. There are no histrionic fights or tearful reconciliations, just the brutal apprehension of the daughter he has surrendered by his cowardice. Quote, she was, he knew, and had known very early, he supposed, one of those rare and always lovely humans whose moral nature was so delicate that it must be nourished and cared for, that it might be fulfilled. Alien to the world, it had to live where it could not be at home. Avid for tenderness and quiet, it had to feed upon indifference and callousness and noise. As a dad, I can barely read this part of Stoner anymore. I think of my own 5-year-old, Rosalie, who does a lot of yelling and not much listening. Every week or so, she steps on someone's last nerve, and that someone, often me, yells at her, at which point she crumbles. Everybody hates me, she'll wail. Everybody wants me to die. It's, I guess, funny, but also, if you're her parent, upsetting, but funny, too. What's gutting about such moments is the sudden revelation of her fragility. Beneath all that bluster is a little girl overmatched by the world of giants around her, painfully aware of the frustration she generates and scared to death that she'll be abandoned. Or I recall the epic tantrum our son Jude threw after his uncle's wedding. He was so inconsolable that I eventually carried him upstairs to a little apartment above the reception area. I want you to help me come down, Papa. He kept howling these words at me. I told him I couldn't bring him downstairs because he was too upset. I want you to help me come down, Papa. On and on it went until, to my horror, I snatched him up and hurled him onto a couch. You're not going anywhere until you calm down, I thundered. My son looked at me, mystified, and instantly I realized what he was actually saying to me, what he had been saying for the past half hour. I want you to help me calm down, Papa. The point isn't that I'm a shitty dad. The point is that being a dad means dealing with the shitty parts, having to face the inner life of your kids, which they cannot hide and which you are often helpless to fix. My own lessons in helplessness have just begun. They'll stack up around me as my children pass into the world and shape their own fates, hand their hearts to the wrong people, suffer the arrows of outrageous fortune, chase their hopes into unseen hazards, To become themselves, our children will have to outgrow the people we imagine them to be, the ones we can keep safe. When I first read Stoner 20 years ago, it was a book about literature as a redemptive force. Then it was a novel about how to endure feuds, then one about the sacred work of teaching, the trials of marriage, then raising kids. The last time I read Stoner, I should admit, it had become a book about death. It will come as no surprise that the closing pages of the book are a meticulous accounting of Stoner's death. At a certain point, as he lies dying, he ponders how others view his life. Quote, dispassionately, reasonably, Stoner contemplated the failure that his life must appear to be. He had dreamed of a kind of integrity, a kind of purity that was entire. He had found compromise and the assaulting diversion of triviality. He had conceived wisdom, and at the end of the long years, he had found ignorance. And what else, he thought? What else? Everyone harbors this merciless voice of judgment. It's the inevitable byproduct of a mind that measures worth using the math of the obituary, in which only the visibly heroic survives the final edit. It's life, minus the inner life. But something fascinating happens after Stoner's done pummeling himself. He falls into a lengthy slumber and wakes with his strength returned. He hears laughter and notices a trio of young couples cutting across his yard. Quote, the girls were long-limbed and graceful in their light summer dresses, and the boys were looking at them with a joyous and bemused wonder. They walked lightly upon the grass, hardly touching it, leaving no trace of where they had been. Stoner is suffused with an abrupt joy which signals the arrival of grace within the perishing body. Quote, he dimly recalled that he had been thinking of failure, as if it mattered. It seemed to him now that such thoughts were mean, unworthy of what his life had been. He dimly recalled that he had been thinking of failure, as if it mattered. Has there ever been a more forgiving sentence written in the English language, a more hopeful sentence? It represents the eternal wish that the arrival of death will cleanse our souls of the petty judgment by which we dishonor the miracle of our inner lives. As someone who struggles with that petty judgment, someone who has dedicated his life fitfully to the transmission of love through the arrest of attention, someone who yearns openly for such a state of grace, I had been elated always to encounter this line. It was like the chunk of chocolate that used to drift to the bottom of the pints of ice cream I devoured on summer evenings in the days before lactose lanced my aging gut. But a strange thing happened the last time I arrived at this line. I broke down sobbing. I broke down sobbing because I thought of my mother and the long, slow, unforgiving manner of her death. My mother, as it should happen, lived a life eminently worthy of praise. She was one of 5 women in the Yale Medical School class of 1960, scattered among 85 men, one of whom was my father. During her residency, she gave birth to 3 children, all boys, in the space of 2 years. She had 1.5, and then 1, and then another 1.5. Do the math. All right. Amid all this, she protested for civil rights, joined the anti-war movement, joined a commune, and learned to weave on a loom, while also rising at 5 a.m. each morning to gather fresh eggs from the hen house so that her sons would not perish. During my childhood, she saw patients all day, then raced home and got dinner on the table and did most of the household cleaning. She was, by any objective measure, a powerful and accomplished woman, a respected therapist, a brilliant pianist, a loving matriarch. But there were moments when the strain showed. Sometimes, as she drove around on errands, she would forget we were in the back seat, and I could hear her drift into an adult soliloquy, whispered enumerations of all that weighed upon her, or I would catch sight of her staring into the distance, shaking her head, as if making peace with the impossibility of her circumstance or gathering for the next depredation. She was bullied in our family, the unacknowledged victim of masculine privilege and the assumed healer of masculine doubt. I believe I have just described every woman on earth. The problem was she didn't have any allies, really. It was all sons and patriarchs. When my older brother graduated from medical school, my mom called her father to share the good news. "Well, Pop," she said, "we've got 3 doctors in the family now." Her father paused, then asked in genuine puzzlement, "Oh yeah? Who's the 3rd? My mother had by this time been a psychiatrist in private practice for 25 years and was training to become a psychoanalyst. The last decade of my mother's life was conducted under the shadow of calamity and illness. At some point between her 2nd and 3rd cancers, she fell on the path outside her office. This fall had a curious effect. It sent her tumbling back to the Bronx of her childhood. She kept asking where her mother was. She was certain I was her uncle. Sometimes she would wake to find herself lying in a strange white room with needles and tubes taped to her arms. "Stevie," she would whisper, "I've just had the most terrible dream." Along with much of her cognitive function, the boundary to her inner life had been breached. By the end of it, my mother had endured half a dozen bouts with cancers and chemo, 2 surgeries, radiation. All this treatment had dulled her fierce intellect, impaired her work, and toward the end, robbed her of reading and music, her last refuges. Like many ambitious people, she experienced illness as a narcissistic injury. She blamed herself for being weak. At the same time, she could hardly acknowledge what was happening to her. Walking into her bedroom, one felt the smothering denial, that queasy code of silence that prevails when a group of people have agreed tacitly and uneasily to live within a frail dream. We couldn't talk about what was really happening. We couldn't say farewell. There came a point, as in Stoner, where sickness took her hostage. She couldn't leave her room without risk of collapse. We worried constantly that she would fall. One day I came into her bedroom to check on her and saw that she had escaped her bed. Then I heard the splashing. She had managed to get herself into the bath somehow, but lacked the strength to get herself out. It was left to my brother Dave and me to lift her from the tub and dry her skin and wipe away the trickles of blood from where she had tried to shave her legs. She was trembling violently the entire time, in tears, clutching at a towel, panicked at the thought that her sons would see her ravaged body. Her body looked beautiful. She looked like Eve. I should admit here that I felt a special burden, in part because I was living across the country as my mother died, but also because I saw us as perpetual allies, the family empaths, the left-handers, the readers. I had always known how vulnerable she was beneath her indomitable energies, and I felt in some secret part of myself that it was my duty to make her happy, to dance the tango with her across the scuffed floors of our kitchen, to get her giggling when she was blue by imitating Harpo Marx. For this reason, it was agonizing to spend time with her at the end, because there was nothing I could do to quell her despair, to lure her back into the province of hope. I couldn't reach her, and feeling helpless, I fled. Every child probably thinks this of his mother, that he's the special one. So I'll admit that this is just my version of the story. But much later, at one of those dreadful gatherings where the guest of honor is missing, a young woman who attended to my mother in her final weeks when my father was too exhausted took me aside. She told me that my mother had sat up at one point and looked around, suddenly alert. Then she had spoken a single word. "Stevie?" My mother lived and died heroically, by all accounts. By all accounts but the one that mattered, her own. Until the very end, she believed she was falling short. She lacked the strength to cook us meals, to come downstairs, to read stories to the kids, to drink her chocolate milkshakes. She was consumed not just by illness, but by a sense of inadequacy. My mother deserved to die at peace with her inner life, like Stoner, to spend her final moments in that promised land. She dimly recalled that she had been thinking of failure, as if it mattered. Having by now thoroughly depressed you, let me depress you further by noting that our entire species is, at this perilous moment in history, engage in a pitched battle for the inner life, one so pervasive that it has become as invisible as air. This struggle has been with us all along. It's ordained by consciousness, the question of whether we can face the solitude of selfhood, the misfortunes engineered by fate and folly, the love we disfigure into cruelty. Over the past half-century, the course of my lifetime, this struggle has degenerated into an all-out assault. To focus on the inner life today, to read books, to think deeply, to imagine with no ulterior agenda, to reflect on painful or confusing experiences, is to defy the clamoring edicts of our age, the buy messages, the ingrained habit of passive consumption. It is not yet a crime, merely a pointless and isolating exercise. There are obvious economic explanations. Vast sectors of our economy are devoted to the magical notion that potions and products and garish spectacle can banish our shame and doubt, and thus corporations which promote and profit by a pervasive state of agitation must eradicate the hauntings of the inner life. Worse yet, they have found ways to compel Americans to put their inner lives on public display, where this data is mined and exploited, not just by corporations, but by those who have discovered in algorithms powerful political weapons by which they can poke at our primal negative emotions, turning us against each other by turning us away from ourselves. A quote: "It is impossible to escape the impression that people commonly use false standards of measurement, that they seek power, success, and wealth for themselves and admire them in others, and that they underestimate what is of true value in life. The fateful question for the human species seems to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect, precisely, the present time deserves special interest. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help, they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current unrest, their unhappiness, and their mood of anxiety." That is Sigmund Freud writing his final lamentation, Civilization and Its Discontents. The year is 1930. Hitler's Nazi party has just won a share of power in the Reichstag. 4 years hence, Hitler will be elected Führer. Freud saw it coming. He understood that there were demagogues and tyrants who sought to activate the dark precincts of the inner life, the parts of us that are destructive, unloved, and therefore unforgiving. Many of you are writers, and all of you are citizens. The making and consumption of literature is a privilege, but it is not a luxury. It is the very manner by which we come to understand our inner lives, by which we travel in difficult truth toward elusive mercy, and thereby reaffirm the bonds of human kindness. I am speaking here of something that goes beyond the fate of our work or the brief span of our lives, what Freud called the eternal. I am speaking of the man or the woman who stands in silence at the top of the stairs just a few seconds longer, feeling the ghost of his beloved mother in his arms, rocking her back and forth. Back and forth. Thanks.
Okay, first of all, I feel like we maybe need just a collective breath after that beautiful and sort of tear your heart out moment and that beautiful craft lecture, so thank you.
Yeah, okay. Sure, thank you guys. I'm not sure I would call it a craft lecture, but it had a little bit of craft in it. So.
Yeah. We told you there would be craft, so there will be some craft. But I also did just learn from Steve that, I was under the impression that this book was out because I had an advanced copy, but it's coming out in early June. And so tonight, the copies available here are super advanced copies. So it's really exciting. You can get them here at the front table.
They're super gone.
Oh, they're super gone. Congratulations.
Great. Okay, well, I'll sign everybody's. All 5 of you. Okay.
Well, yes, because I did promise Rob we would talk craft. I'm jumping right in. There's a wonderful line in Stoner where you say, "I learned more about craft from reading Stoner than any workshop I ever took."
A great shout out to my teachers.
Yeah. Right, so we could take that a number of ways. But I am curious, in terms of literary craft, what did Stoner have to teach you, and what have you tried to sort of emulate in your own writing? This book is very much an exegesis. He's examining the novel Stoner as he's sort of weaving in his own experience, and he's analyzing it and really breaking apart. And for any English majors out there who miss this experience, I highly recommend the book. Like, reading them in tandem is what I did. I actually read your book first, and then I thought, oh man, I'm screwed. This novel's going to be terribly boring now because I know what's going to happen. And instead, I just felt like it really enhanced the experience of reading it. I was completely captivated, and so I guess side note, thank you for turning so many people onto this book. But so you have chapters sort of dedicated to craft, but maybe you could speak a little bit to it here for the room.
Yeah, I mean, we talked in class that, by the way, the classes have been a delight, and everybody just did amazing writing, and thank you for all the students who are here. And I think, actually, I learned lots in workshop, but mostly I think the way that writers learn is by reading the work of people who are at their proximate level, and then very compassionately but precisely trying to critique the work of people whose lesser decisions they can see and explain to themselves. And that's really what I learned the most from in graduate school, is reading the slush pile. You read 1,500 stories by writers who are at the beginning of their careers, you're gonna learn and see the same mistakes over and over again. And eventually it gets through your head that you're actually making those same mistakes and perhaps should not. But also doing really long, detailed critiques, which I thought was me being generous and being a good boy, but was in fact me trying to tell myself what decisions were good and why, and what decisions on the page weren't as good. Developing a critical faculty. But the reason that I have learned so much from Stoner is partly that I just have read it so many times, and that I've done several book clubs, and I taught a class where we talked about it for 8 hours, which went by like this. We were like, wait, we just haven't even gotten started. We're just on chapter 1. But as part of that, I literally tried to figure out its mechanisms of enthrallment. How is this book sucking me into its world every time, over and over again? Some of that is a function of the fact that our favorite novels are really manuals for living, and that they track our inner life. So Stoner begins for me as a book about getting turned on by literature, and then it becomes a book about teaching, right? And then it becomes a book about feuds, right? And then it becomes a book about cell phones ringing in rooms of, right? And then it becomes a book about raising kids, and then about death, and so forth. So that's one of the central lessons, is that a really good piece of literature is never the same twice, because you've changed, and literature is unique in the art forms because you really have to do the heavy lifting imaginatively and emotionally. It isn't all supplied for you. You don't passively sit back and have a world constructed by 1,000 people. It's just you and the book, and you're doing a lot of the work. So as you shift and change, it becomes a different book because you've become different. But I also literally mapped out exactly what decisions Williams was making, and why every single moment is so packed with drama, and every single moment is consequential to what comes later. There are no subplots. We're only introduced to the things that matter. The writing, as I hope I was able to convey, is very simple and direct. And what the book is just a compendium of all the moments that mattered the most to this one guy. Every moment of consequence is tracked. Every single person in this room, if they took the time to transcribe and think about and reflect on and try to wrestle onto the page every moment that really was huge and important emotionally and confusing and harrowing and ecstatic, would have a great novel. I'm convinced of it. I mean, it's really hard to do that, but there's nobody who isn't equipped with a complex, tumultuous inner life. And what Stoner does is that's it. He doesn't have to worry about sending him off to war or getting the girl or any of that stuff. He just finds every moment where this guy's life is in upheaval, and he refuses to turn away from it. And that's kind of the central thing that I think you're supposed to be doing, especially in fiction, but nonfiction as well, is finding the moments that really matter, where things are kind of bearing down on a character and then staying in the room, right?
I love that idea that the book is kind of the river that you never enter into the same way twice. And you mentioned this in your lecture as well, that when you read it, different stages in your life, different things are going on, your kids, your parents aging. So did that structure of this book in particular immediately make itself apparent to you? Did you know going in what you were doing with this book?
Oh, the new book, the William Stoner book?
Yes.
Yeah, no, not really. I just thought, well, yeah, I kind of talk a good game when it comes to kind of being organized, but I'm not really very organized as a writer. I did know that there were particular aspects of it that I wanted to make sure I explored, because this is not a book that's part of the canon that people have torn apart. So I think, for instance, Stoner is a really brilliant and important book about class and about poverty and wealth, and about the way in which, if you grow up in poor and you're suddenly transported into a life that's more comfortable materially, you carry with you the legacy of that guilt and the sense of betrayal, and therefore you engineer misfortune in your life. The sort of social novel says, oh, well, if Pip does well, or David Copperfield, or whoever, then he's happy. And that's bullshit. Because I think people are loyal to the feelings that they had in their childhood. And they feel tremendous guilt if they leave people behind. That's the real version of kind of the class novel. That's why he chooses a wife who is wealthy and quite damaged, and who makes his life miserable. He engineers his own misfortune. And he admits it at the end of the book. His daughter says, well, you sure didn't make things easy for yourself. And he says, well, I suppose I didn't want to. And it's so refreshing to encounter somebody in this world of bullshit who admits that a lot of the time we're really self-destructive and masochistic, because we feel guilty and we kind of carry that around. So I got off on a tangent, but I just tried to think hard about the different aspects of the book. I certainly wanted to write about narration and a lot of things that I've told, kind of browbeaten students with over the years, because Stoner is such an exemplar of efficient narration and how important it is, how much people confuse surprise and suspense, how much they try to withhold from the reader out of insecurity, oftentimes. But I really just wanted to look around and sort of say, there's a chapter about that I have a little bit in the talk about being a parent, or about kind of dealing with death. There's a chapter about teaching, which I think I've thought a lot about. There's a chapter about conflict and how we avoid it and how we can't avoid it, and that's a lot of what Stoner's about. So I probably had half written this book before I even sat down, because that's kind of what I do, is write about things that I'm really preoccupied by, which I think everybody does. Just sometimes you're conscious of it, and sometimes you're not entirely conscious of it.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of internalization going on there. The structure of Steve's book, I should say, of Stoner, it's essentially like it feels a little bit to me like if you married biography with autofiction. I mean, it really starts at the beginning of his life and ends at the end of his life. And it just goes in that one arc, right? One direction. And your book, to a degree, follows that same arc.
Yeah.
And it just feels very natural.
Yeah, and it's organic because when I first read it, I thought, oh wow, a novel about literature saving people, and that's what I'm going through, I hope. And then a few years later, when all the professors in my MFA program couldn't stand me, and I was in this horrible conflicts with them, I was like, oh my God, it's a novel about feuds, and and then and so on that way. But it is a book that I think in the tradition of literature kind of marries sort of all the virtues of somebody like Hemingway with all that is, he's able to get an incredible amount of emotion out of simple observation of the natural world. And somebody like Joyce, whose innovation was that sort of the fluctuations of the mind were what drove, and sensation were kind of what drive his books. And somehow Stoner is able to have this incredible narrative efficiency, but you're also really deep inside his experience when things are going down.
I guess on the subject of things that you browbeat your students with, one being I guess sort of lancing the whole show don't tell thing. And raise your hands, those of you out here who've been told that by a teacher at some point, show don't tell, guys. So can you speak a little bit to that? And
yeah, I can speak a little bit to it because I think about it a lot. So, the idea is a good one, that in important moments, you should not assert emotion, you should, the character should experience it. And the purest form of that is moment to moment in scene. That's a good, virtuous thought. The problem is, and I think this is partly because writers are under the aegis of TV and movies, because visual storytelling is the central form of storytelling in our culture, that people take show don't tell as a kind of blanket endorsement that showing is always better and telling is always bad. Really what we should say is tell just enough that the reader can feel what they're being shown. And the example I use in class, which really tries to sort of bring the point home, is because I think writers, myself included, tend to jump into scene. That's the place we go to because we think that's what's vivid and show don't tell and media res, right? Don't have info dumps and all these kind of bromides. So we vilify the act of narration as if it's some bureaucratic concern, when in fact it's unbelievably pleasurable because the reader wants information. The reader wants to know, where am I? What's going on? What's at stake? Who's in the room? What are their relationships? So when you're sort of thinking, oh, show don't tell, you get the idea, for instance, to want to write a story where you trap people in, like two people in a small space, right? And so you might have a middle-aged man and a woman. That's a weird sound. There's like a whole situation happening over there. But anyway, so you might think, like Hitchcock always said, trap people in a small space. So you could put a man and a woman in an elevator. And because you're showing the reader and using those showing muscles, you could have lots of vivid detail, like sweat is rilling down the woman's, armpit and along her ribs, and the man is loosening his collar, and they're casting sidelong glances at one another, and they're, kind of doing a ballet about who's going to press the elevator button. And we would be like, okay, those two are pretty jacked up. That's a vivid scene because there are two people in an elevator who seem quite nervous. But you could tell that story in another way, where you tell the reader up front, hey, these two people met in high school and they fell in love. And it took them a while, but then they got married. And they had a couple of kids and careers, and it was a complicated marriage, which is to say it was a marriage. And they had to work at it, and they had a really happy date night, 10th anniversary, and along comes a third kid, and they get to their, 20th anniversary, and they decide to splurge and buy an in-ground pool because they all love swimming. The two big kids, the parents, and the third kid who's 4 or 5, and it's life's rich pageant. The thing is that the youngest kid, like all 4 or 5-year-olds, thinks they can swim, but really they can't entirely. They need a floaty. And some weekend or another, one of the parents goes out of town, and the other parent's doing their best, but having to drive the older kids to a soccer game and a play date, whatever else it is, and somehow the gate is left open, and somehow that 4-year-old kid wanders through the gate. And then they're living in a different story, and nobody knows that story except people who have been through it. And even the healthiest marriage under that kind of pressure might not be salvageable. So then the next few years of their lives are trying to work it out and doing all that work and realizing they can't. They can't get to forgiveness, and they're going to have to divorce, even though they don't want to. And then in the course of divorcing, they're probably going to say and do some things they regret. And finally, even though they promised that they would be amicable, they both lawyer up, and one or another of them gets a fancy lawyer, and probably the hardest day of their life is the day that they have to go sign the papers and make it real. And now they've got this fancy lawyer who's all the way in the penthouse, and the only way to get to the penthouse is to ride the elevator. Okay? And those are the two people who are in that elevator. And you can't tell me that putting two people who are nervous in an elevator is a story. It's not. You can show all you want, but unless you tell the reader what they need to know, they cannot feel the emotional significance of what they're seeing. So we just have to entirely reinvent that bromide. It's not that we have to throw it away. When people are trying to assert emotion or using exposition in a moment when we need scene, good. You say to them, hey, show don't tell. Or you've already shown me that, you don't have to tell me that now. Or I'd rather be shown that and have the character experience it than have the author or the narrator assert it. That's good, that's fine, that's good teaching. But I think students accept show don't tell as like, oh my God, I can't have a narrator telling the reader things. And the only way that I can convey who a character is by indirect characterization. I have to march them through scenes rather than doing what good old Jane Austen does. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, young, and clever, right? Who just badass says, here's who Emma Woodhouse is. She's had things too much her way, and she's going to get her comeuppance. And the reader goes, thank you. I want to read that novel.
It's a lot more efficient than, 6 pages in. Once the scene is done, you figure out, right, who Emma is.
And a lot of it is just people trying to write our way into our characters and figure that. I do the same thing, but I can see it. I see it so frequently in student manuscripts now.
Yes, definitely. Okay, another Steve Almondism is the write your obsessions. Not so much write what you know, but write what obsesses you. And in your case, that has been candy and football, and in this case, the novel Stoner. And I'm curious because you do have these wonderful. Your relationship with this book runs deep and long, and these scenes of like the book clubs you're hosting at your house, where people are old men and professors kind of coming in talking about it. You have carried this book around with you for decades. So, I guess I have a couple of questions related to that. How do you know that it's time to write about a particular obsession, and how did you know that it was time to write about this one?
That's a great question. You don't really. What I would say is, like, somebody said, oh, there's this series where you get to write about your favorite book, you should do it. And I was like, okay. All right. That seems like a good use of my limited talents. I'll do it. Or the football book was somebody saying, I used to be a journalist. Like sometimes it comes from inside you and you realize the heavens part and intuitive voice says, you must write this book. But usually not. Usually it's some much more kind of like somebody asks, right? So the football books, an editor was like, hey, I saw you wrote that thing for the, this magazine about football. Could you write a whole book about that? And I was like, yeah, probably, since football is like the biggest thing in our culture, and I've loved it and also hated myself for loving it for like 20 years. But there are other books like the Candy, the Candy Freak was not some book. I was like, I'm gonna write a book about candy and late model capitalism. Like, that was not how that happened. It was more like I wrote a horrible novel, I wrote a book of short stories that came out. The world did not suddenly, like, all my exes didn't call and say, we were wrong, you're a good guy. That didn't happen at all. And it sort of passed from the world, it had its life, but then I was like, oh, what do I do next? And I had an agent who pulled the string and they say, why don't you write a novel? So I wrote a novel, and it was awful, and it took me 2 years to write it, and it took her 40 seconds to say that, and she was right, okay? And then I fell into a depression. Okay, here's my process. It's a process question. So, here's what you do. And I fell into a depression, and the only thing that would get me out of bed was chocolate. And then I thought, well, how can I get myself into a place where they're making chocolate? And I thought, oh, well, I can go into a factory, I can write a story, I can fool a journalist, a newspaper into sending me to a factory. So I'd been a journalist, so I was like, I want to write about, the Necco wafers and go visit their factory, some bullshit. Anyway, they let me go to the factory, and the moment I got into the factory, this like horrible depression just lifted. And I was like, ooh, I feel happy. The elevators smell like Halloween. The Necco wafers are like the most beautiful, mosaic on the floor. Everything here is beautiful. There are bunnies made of marshmallows being enrobed with chocolate before my eyes. I am in heaven. So, literally, all I did, my thought, this was my really complicated literary evolution at this point. My only thought was, I would like to get back into another factory. And so, this is before the internet, so I wrote a whole bunch of letters to a whole bunch of candy companies saying, I am a writer, I have a book, full of pornographic short stories, but still I have a book. And so then I started visiting, the Twin Bing factory and the Idaho Spud factory and the Goo Goo Cluster factory and all those fucking crazy candy bars. And every time I would visit, I would be incredibly happy and super alive and interested in paying attention. And that's kind of the thing that you need to write something, is to just be paying attention, to be excited enough and interested enough to kind of circle around to your question about obsession. But at the same time that I was doing all that, I was thinking, this is kind of a stupid, sad thing to be doing. Guy who was going to write the great American novel. This is sort of sad that you're kind of getting off on chocolate bunnies. So the process wasn't like, oh, I found it. It was like, I am slumming, and I am sad. I'm a sad man. But also, I've got a lot of free candy, and this is awesome. So, and then I wrote, kind of wrote the book, but I sent it off to agents, and they were like, ugh, what is this? This is weird. One of them says, one of them wrote me a note saying, we don't know where this would go in Borders, which is kind of funny now. So I put it in a drawer. I just put it in a drawer for, and then this is why it is important to have friends. And it's important to have, not just friends, like literary friends. People who know what you're up to, or kind of like you hold each other accountable. I know that that's a lot of what Hugo House is trying to do, is bring people into proximity, and your teachers can only do so much. You also have to find your people, your tribe of readers. And my tribe was like, didn't you go to Idaho and, write about the Idaho, visit the Idaho Spud? Like, whatever happened to that book? And I was like, it was awful, it was stupid, it was this crazy thing, and I shouldn't have done it. It's just, I'm a sad loser, I'm going back to bed. And they said, well, but, could we at least see what you wrote? And they didn't say, like, oh, it's great, but they did say, this is really interesting. You shouldn't just put this aside. And so then I started to take it more seriously and say, actually, maybe there is something interesting here. Because even if it feels superficial, in fact, candy was very profound to me. It was my first antidepressant. It was the path that I used as a kid away from despair. And guess what? As an adult, too. So Candy Freak winds up being a book partly about depression. And then if you really look at, and the things that people will do to find a path from despair. And then if you really look at anything carefully, as David Foster Wallace shows us in everything he writes, it's all really fascinating. What matters isn't the quality of somebody's life, it's the quality of attention that's paid to that life. It doesn't matter what the subject is, it's the quality of attention that's given to that subject. So, you know, but I urge people to write about their obsessions because the point of this all, there was a point. The point is that's what got me to the keyboard. And for me as a writer, it is so hard to sit and write and quiet my mind and make all those decisions where many of them are bad decisions the first few times. It's just hard to do. I see people all the time and, you know, oh, you're a writer? I was thinking of writing a novel. And I always want to say, great, why don't you? It's like, I call your fucking bluff, dude. Write a book. Here's my email. Tell me how it's going. Because people who haven't done, you know, tried to sit there at a keyboard and you know, make all those decisions are really cavalier about it. So my feeling is you need something that helps you, that you're really interested in. You need some help. You should be really urgently interested in what you're writing about if you would like your reader to be urgently interested in it.
Thank you. Wow. I have the tears streaming down my face because I'm laughing so hard, but also in the midst of you talking about writing Candy Freak, I flash back to my 19-year-old self reading Candy Freak, and here I am 15 years later, like on stage with the guy talking about Candy Freak. Anyway, a little emotional for me. That was awesome. That was beautiful, though. And I think on that note, so I'm so interested, both in the book that you wrote and in the novel Stoner. You know, one of the classes I teach here at the Hugo House and in the King County Jail is a class I call Mindful Writing, which is about sort of writing as a contemplative practice, or the parallels between writing and contemplative practice. And so much of that is just being attentive to your own life, attentive to the world around you, slowing down, all the things you mentioned. And we are living in a time when that is so hard. I mean, I'm sure it's always been hard, but you know, you have some wonderful quotes in this book about sort of, you know, living in the, not just like the era of social media when you say the academic is no match for the entertainer in the attention economy, but you know, politics, the market, all of these things that drive, you know, for a lot of people, drive writing. If you want to be a writer, you got to pay attention to the market, all these things. But I would love to hear you speak about sort of writing and paying attention to the interior life and the inner life in this age of distraction. How do you balance all of, because you also, you know, in your short pieces, you are sort of tapped in, you're paying attention to what's going on around us all the time. I mean, the fire's happening day after day. And it's, you know, exhausting for a lot of people. It's personal for so many of us. And so I'm curious, how do you balance all of that input with your creative output and maintain like a sense of focus and cultivate your inner life while also letting like the outside in to the degree that you do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the kind of honest answer is, I don't know. I'm kind of doing it by feel and making some stupid decisions. I didn't really need to write about Elizabeth Warren's decision to not go on Fox this week. I didn't really need to write that piece. But some of it, you know what I mean? So I think I have that freedom app where you just like won't allow yourself on the internet. Like I need that help. Wallace Stevens, the poet, talks about this in the last book, Bad Stories. I was interested in the way in which our distraction and attention economy has led to these bad outcomes. And he talked about the pressure of the real, which was this unceasing stream of bad stories that robs people of their capacity to wonder and imagine, to do the work of literary art or any other kind of art. And that is something that we are now responsible for. We now have these incredibly powerful devices and screens, as Ray Bradbury predicted back in the early 50s, that we would eventually be sitting in front of the parlor walls with little earbuds in, kind of zoning out. Like he was Black Mirror way before Black Mirror. And so it's, now that we have these tools that allow us to kind of be distracted and get agitated and distracted from the sort of deep concentration that you need to do, especially if you're working on a novel, but even a short, any sustained piece of work, you have to be able to put that world aside and say, the news cycle is going to continue to grind on. That's a blender I don't need to stick my hand in every day. If it's not my job. And so then, you know, I think it's really incumbent upon people to say, I have got to figure out when I write the best, when my attention is the sharpest, and under what circumstances. Do I do better with coffee or wine? Do I do better or nothing, or, I don't know, pot, or whatever it is. Amy Bender says this. I love her writing, all of her writing, and we did a panel, and she said something that seemed like so intuitive, and it took me a little while to figure out how fucking smart it was. She said, well, just think about what the circumstances were when you wrote the best piece you ever wrote, the piece you're proudest of, and try to replicate those circumstances. And because we get questions, I get questions about, like, what's your process? And I'm like, you don't want my process, trust me. But even more, it wouldn't help you. I remember a famous writer visited my MFA program and he said, you cannot begin to enter the deep sanctum of your work unless you sit at the keyboard for 4 hours. And for years I was like, okay, 4 hours. I gotta be at the keyboard for 4 hours before I can do real work. No, that worked for him, but for you have to figure out, based on your circadian rhythm, you know, based on your, kind of do a self-inventory of what allows you to block out all those distractions. And that means you kind of have to be your own boss, and you have to think, oh, well, maybe I need to make sure that I don't have access to screens, or any other screens other than, you know, a computer if you're writing on that. And nobody's going to do that for you. An MFA program and the Hugo House will give you a class, and will give you people who expect you to turn in work and hopefully expect you to do you know, responsible critiquing. That's great, that structure. But nobody's going to follow you home and say, now you have to carve space in your busy life with all the other things that are bearing down on you, relationships and your economic responsibilities and your social responsibility, your familial experience. That's all on you guys. And so you have to get organized about it. And that would be the central thing I would say, is like, do a self-inventory. If you write best in the morning, then figure out how to get those morning hours. And if you write best in short bursts or an hour at a time, then great, structure that into it. And if you do need a lot of time, then, you know, check with your people and say, I need 3 days or I need a week. And I will do the hard work the rest of the time so that I get that long period to write. Nobody is going to do that for you. You have to be really your own boss about that stuff.
Love that bit of wisdom from Amy Bender. She's awesome. I have so many questions, Steve, but I want to make sure that we also get some audience questions in, and it sounds like it's time. So, yeah, Kristen.
Hi, so I was just wondering, you talked about the protagonist of Stoner being someone where literature had saved his life. But when I saw him live out his life on the page, what I saw is someone who did not translate the knowledge that he received in books to the relationships he had with women in his life. To the extent that his damaged wife, who it seemed to me had been abused by her father and was living in a state of shame and regret and trying to protect her own child from him, he never talked about it, broached it, did anything to carry the knowledge that he received from literature into his life. And then again, when he has the affair with his colleague, her career is ruined. He just lets her go and lets that happen and does nothing. And so for me, like, part of the question.
Yeah, don't worry, we'll repeat it. Yeah.
The question is, how do we make literature a catalyst for action and not a refuge for people who are unable to translate the messages the wisdom they receive in books into their lives?
Yeah, wow. So the question is really making the observation that Stoner reads a lot and loves literature, but cannot translate the lessons of literature into his own relationships, and therefore is quite destructive in the context of that. I will assure you that William Stoner in The Battle for the Inner Life has a long chapter about the misogynist nature of both William Stoner himself and the book, which did not occur to me until recently, because I'm an idiot. But it certainly did. And I disagree with some of what you said about his, I think he's actually a very good and loving father, and there's nothing to suggest that he's, any risk to his daughter. Quite the contrary, emotionally and psychologically. But nonetheless, it's true that what he grabs from literature is actually not helpful in his relationships. He has a romantic idea of finding a wife from Abelard and Eloise that is not real. He doesn't see her. He can't see her in a real way as a real person. But I don't exactly know how you enforce. You can't say to people, you must learn this lesson from this book or poem. That's not how it works. You can't be a commissar in the world of art. People, now I certainly try, in Dear Sugars, what I did was to try to say, hey, actually, in the world of literature, there's a lot of really great advice. And this is advice that you can use in the context of your relationships, to think about how we engineer bad outcomes with people we love, or survive the sorrow of our childhood, or all that stuff. But aside from trying to make that case on the podcast, that's about as much as I would do to try to control how people respond to art and what lessons they get from it. What I will say that I think is really powerful and important to think about is that everybody has an artistic impulse and a creative impulse. And some of the most tyrannical, despicable people that we can imagine, in fact, were failed artists. I mentioned one of them in my talk. So a sensitivity to art and the creative world isn't a reflection of the morality that you exercise in the world. I think people are improved by reading and engaging with art because it enlarges their moral imagination and forces them to try to think about experiences that aren't their own. But you cannot enforce that on somebody. Everybody gets to have their own experience. When I read Moby Dick now in this context, I say, oh, I see. Wounded male aggression, if it becomes the central story in a culture, leads to a doomed expedition where everybody dies. But I can't enforce that experience on somebody else reading Moby Dick, if you see what I mean. And I feel uncomfortable with the idea. It's sort of against the ethos of the creative act to try to sort of legislate what people learn from it, right?
Thank you. Other questions? Front row.
You mentioned earlier about slowing down where it hurts, and I've also heard you, or maybe Ann Houston, attribute you with the push on the bruise idea. So can you talk a little bit more about slowing down where it hurts, and then selfishly, how?
Okay, so the question is talk more about slowing down where it hurts, and also how do you do that? Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess what I would say is that what you're trying to do in any kind of fiction or nonfiction, and Stoner is really a great example of this, not because you're being a meanie, but because you're trying to get to what Graham Greene called the heart of the matter, is to figure out the places where a character is in trouble or in danger, is endangered by their desires, is endangered by their fears, by their inhibitions. Stoner, for instance, is really endangered by the fact that he is passive and he doesn't take action and he can't respond to the people in his life that he needs to. And to figure out the moments where things go terribly wrong, and sometimes even terribly right for a character, but where there's a kind of uncontrollable emotion that gets out of their control. And the reason that we're reluctant to do that is because that's actually quite an uncomfortable place to be in our civilian lives and also in our writing lives. But at least the literature that I'm interested in is the kind that zeroes in on moments that are quite confusing, where people are overrun with feeling. And the result of that generally is that if you're willing to stay in the room, like the guy at the top of the stairs, if you just stay there, what happens naturally is that the writer has to the language has to reach up into the lyric register in order to try to capture the intensity of what it feels like in those moments, where you might be terribly in pain or terribly confused, but you're also terribly alive, which means you're paying attention. And this is true, for instance, in moments that are traumatic in your family life or your relationship life. You don't want to have to go back there, but you know it's back there. And so when you come to those moments in your stories, it's kind of it's about your will. Do you want to do that or not? And if you don't, I believe that your stories are going to suffer by that. They're not going to reach as deep as they should. But I don't always get there, and I chicken out more than I stay in the room. But I know that the thing I should do is stay in the room.
Thanks. Other questions? Got probably time for one more. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering,
Do you want that?
No.
You can do it. You have the mic link.
I'm about to start an MFA program, and I was just wondering about your advice on how to be a really great participant in workshop. I always feel really nervous about giving feedback to other writers, and I want to be effective in that, but it's also like scary.
So the question is how to be a good participant in workshop, and also you were saying that it feels you're a little unsettled by the idea of giving feedback. So I'll tell you, I've thought a lot about this because the workshops, like my MFA experience, as I write about in the new book, was terrible. By the end of my MFA program, neither one of the fiction faculty would read my work. They didn't acknowledge me. It was terrible. So definitely don't do what I do. But in retrospect, MFA programs are great, and like any educational experience, 98% of it is just what you put in is what you're going to get out. What I do in workshop, and I can't guarantee that this is going to be the sort of workshop that you'll have, but I've thought a lot about what has to happen for a workshop to really work. And here's my feeling. You have to establish enough trust that people can really be honest. And they can be honest because the person whose work is up knows that this feedback is intended to help them make the piece better. And so I ask my students, each of the students in the room, to write a one-sentence summary of what they think the piece is about, which sounds really reductive and awful, but is actually, to the writer, incredibly important. Both because it's a little bit like the blind man and the elephant, everybody's touching a different part of the elephant, but also because even when we finish a piece, we're not always entirely aware of what is in it. And different readers will notice different things. So, but when we go around, you can see the writer gaining a sense of like, oh, they get what I'm trying to do. They get it. Because if you just start, what happened in my MFA program is people just competed, it was like my family essentially, people competed to see who could be the smartest about being mean. And it became like just awful, like piranha. And I think that's a failure of the teachers, because I don't allow that, and I don't think teachers should allow that. It's just the opposite. So after we finished giving a one-sentence summary of the piece, then we talk about all of the places where the piece is working the best. And I ask people to read passages and talk about why they like them. And I do that because the person who's up is, you think you're nervous giving feedback, think about getting it. You know, people really have invested a lot of time and energy and hope in their writing, and they don't want it to be shit on. They don't want it to be dismissed or patted on the head. They're not asking for a hug. They want to go all the way. And that means that it's that intimate, and that means that you have to establish this atmosphere of real trust. So the second thing is, let's talk about every place where the piece is working and work from the assumption that our job as a workshop is to try to bring the piece up to that highest level. Once that's done, and the writer feels like, okay, this group is trying to help me out, then, and only then, do we start to get into, okay, that being said, as much as I love this passage here, where you've set up the scene brilliantly, you really leap into a scene 2 pages later, and I have no idea what's going on. And then the writer can actually hear it. As to this, to this concern about offering feedback, part of that, I think, is gendered, I'm just going to say. I think, men are given the right to have a big opinion, and women, if they try to have a big opinion, have all kinds of voices that they've internalized from patriarchal thought and cultures, essentially saying, you don't have the right to say that. So some of this is, I think, especially what I saw in the workshops that I was in, is very gendered. But what I would urge you to realize is the active critique is the thing that you're going to learn the most from. So regardless of, and I think there is a way to offer critique that's incredibly generous. And I would not muzzle yourself, because you're losing the opportunity, really, especially if it's challenging for you, you're losing the educational opportunity of saying, actually, I do have important thoughts, and I want a workshop where everybody talks, not just the 3 people who really like to hear themselves talk.
I actually had a really bad experience last summer in Brentwood, where my writing was just eviscerated, and I was fine with it at the time, but then afterwards, like 5 different people came up separately and said, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Oh God, I guess I'm not okay."
Yeah.
That's bad.
Yeah. So, I don't know what sort of workshop you'll have, and you can't really control that. The only thing you can control is how you, as a teacher, I get to control it. But I don't know what sort of workshop experience you'll have. I just know that you can only control what you do as a student, and please don't muzzle yourself. It's really simple. Everybody walking into the room is really vulnerable. Just don't be an asshole. Try to be like a nice person, right? It's not like it's rocket science. That seems like a nice place
Let's
to
take
end.
that beyond the workshop and this out into our labs tonight. Thank you, Steve Almond.
Yeah.